This is all that remains of the Ethiopian consulate in Hargeisa, in Somalia's northern province of Somaliland, following an attack by a young man from Minnesota, Shirwa Ahmed, the first known American suicide bomber. 30 people were killed, dozens more injured and maimed during 6 synchronized suicide bombings at 3 locations across the city. Shirwa Ahmed was among the first of at least 20 young Somali-American men who left their homes in Minneapolis to go and fight in their ancestral country. A homeland of which they had virtually no recollection. Many of them decided to take up arms and join Al-Shabaab, a group of fighters with a radical interpretation of Islam and direct links to Al-Qaeda after a US-backed invasion of Somalia. The reaction in the US was one of astonishment and concern. Suddenly, their so-called war on terror was facing a homegrown threat.
This wasn't a purely jihadist instance. This was jihadism mixed with nationalism, people saying, I want to go defend my country, and it happened quite rapidly.
Authorities responded with the largest domestic investigation since the attacks of 9/11. The Somali population in Minneapolis, the largest in the world outside Somalia, felt under attack by law enforcement agencies, the media, and their fellow Americans. The road from Minneapolis to Mogadishu became a long journey for a whole community.
And declare today that I am a citizen.
Becoming American, a day filled with emotion for those pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes.
So help me God. Congratulations.
A symbol of freedom, equality, and opportunity. For some, it's a lifelong dream come true, the end of a long, tortuous, and often traumatic journey, and the promise of a new beginning. But it's also a parting with pieces of their past, families, friends, and homes left behind, a new identity replacing the ones they've always known. In this Minneapolis courthouse, most of the 70 people taking the oath of citizenship are from Somalia, not unusual at all here. They are the largest minority in the state, very visible, very active, and very proud. They are also very much what ties Somalia with the US.
America's involvement with Somalia predates the arrival of large numbers of immigrants to these shores. In the early 90s, the United States led international efforts to save Somalia from civil war and famine. It proved to be traumatic for both. Operation Restore Hope was launched in December of 1992. It was initially intended to help relieve a famine that was ravaging the country in the wake of the Civil War and the overthrow of the military government. A humanitarian crisis that claimed more than 300,000 lives and left millions more displaced.
The intervention in 1993 was, in my view, very simple. It was to stop a serious famine in south-central Somalia.
The goal was to clear a secure corridor for food and emergency aid, to get into the country and to have it delivered to those most in need. Warlords had taken advantage of 2 years of civil war to divide the country into areas of personal control. A lack of any coherent government or national military force left Somalia completely vulnerable to gangs of armed bandits. They had looted much of the humanitarian assistance and kept it from the hungry and desperate, using it as currency to increase their power and influence. But the US-led intervention was successfully limiting the influence of the warlords. Even the most powerful ones were feeling the pressure, including General Mohammed Farah Aidid, who controlled half of the capital, Mogadishu.
It is a wonderful, wonderful mission of mercy, and I'm so proud that our military is performing it so well.
The famine was winding down. U.S. troops were looking to leave, turning it over to the United Nations. But increasingly, Mohammed Farah Aidid was becoming concerned that he was being politically marginalized in the country, and that the UN was, the U.S. initially, and then the UN was taking over, maybe distributing power in a different kind of way. And as he felt marginalized, he increasingly started hitting out at the international presence.
I'm Somali, I'm with my people, I'm in a very good position. I'm stronger than any.
In June 1993, 24 Pakistani soldiers, members of the international effort, were ambushed and massacred during an inspection of a weapons storage site in Mogadishu. General Aidid was blamed for the attack, and his arrest became the new priority for the mission.
It was a pretty horrible incident, with some of them disemboweled and eyes gouged out, and it left just an incredibly negative reaction in New York. And the immediate response was, we have got to stop Aidid and indeed capture or kill him. At which point, the whole nature of the operation changed, and from that point on, it all went downhill, because it no longer was a humanitarian mission. It was getting a Somali leader, and that was the beginning of the end.
The next few months saw the coalition forces pulled deeper into a bloody, murderous quagmire as they tried to rid Somalia of the warlords. Soldiers who had come to feed the hungry ended up fighting a new, unexpected war.
Please evacuate the area now!
Attack after counterattack proved costly. The number of casualties was rising fast, and the US government's resolve was starting to weaken. On October the 3rd, 1993, an assault by US forces on the Olympic Hotel in the center of Mogadishu proved a pivotal point. Special forces believed they had intelligence that would lead to the arrest of General Aidid. It was a trap. They were ambushed. Black Hawk Down, as the incident came to be known, saw US Black Hawk helicopters shot down in the middle of the city, their soldiers trapped and surrounded by enemy fire. US forces got caught in a ferocious gun battle as they tried to extricate their pilots from the wreckage. 18 US soldiers were killed, 84 more wounded. Countless Somali civilians and fighters were also killed.
There was the horrible situation where one of the dead soldiers was drug around the city of Mogadishu at the end of a rope, deceased, and that ran on CNN and other television stations non-stop for the next 48 hours. The reverberations in Washington were just horrific. How could this happen? How did this humanitarian effort come to this end? And the outrage was just overwhelming. The Clinton administration decided within a day or two of that incident that the continued U.S. presence in Somalia was no longer sustainable.
President Clinton, in fact, decided to cut U.S. losses and announced that troops would be fully withdrawn from Somalia by the end of March 1994, a mere 5 months after Black Hawk Down. While the U.S. cut off direct political involvement in Somalia after the war, the Americans did face their responsibility to the country and the humanitarian crisis they were leaving behind by opening their doors to Somali refugees. Millions, mostly the educated and middle classes, fled to neighboring countries, Europe, Canada, and of course, the US, leaving Somalia at the mercy of warlords once again. Somalis settled in Minneapolis in numbers, most of them joining extended family members already settled here and expected to help to provide for the family members they had left behind.
When Somalis settled in places like Minneapolis and the communities grew, there were still very strong links back with what was happening in Somalia, wasn't there? It wasn't just the idea of you emigrate, you cut your ties and you start again.
Those linkages are extremely, extremely important to understand, actually. on many different levels. One is the basic one is that you have most of your family stuck in a conflict zone. And even if they were able and successful to get out of the Somali border and go to refugee camps, they are still in a very precarious situation in refugee camps, either in Ethiopia or Kenya. The economic imperative that emerges from the conflict, the person who is in the U.S. or who was lucky enough to have made it to a Western nation is responsible to provide for the siblings, parents, cousins, relatives. And we're talking about sometimes hundreds of people.
These bonds between those who left the homeland and those who remain would prove lethal as the turmoil continued and the U.S. could no longer ignore the growing chaos in Somalia.
Minneapolis, St. Paul.
35W out of downtown Minneapolis. It's up to
48 degrees, east winds at 16.
official weather station.
A night not fit for man nor beast.
The weather, a constant topic of discussion in the U.S. Midwest. With such extremes of cold, winds, heat and rain, it's no wonder. This is the country's Corn Belt, the state of Minnesota famous for its beautiful, clean lakes and brutally cold winters. The urban centers of Minneapolis and the state capital, St. Paul, the Twin Cities, are home to an estimated 100,000 Somali immigrants, most of them refugees of the Civil War and first-generation Somali Americans.
1993, 1994, we at least get to know each other, we visit each other. We were just very small community. And if you come 10 years ago, they were less than 10%. But now, if you drive by or just walk in, you won't see anybody else except Somalis.
Hashi Shafi is a highly respected community leader. He was among the first wave of Somali refugees who came to Minneapolis after fleeing the Civil War. He's seen how the community has grown since the mid-90s.
So our aim was to earn money and send back to those loved ones that we left back and bring them or whatever, just sponsor them. When we came, there's nobody just was here for us. So we just put together some money and borrow from each other and put some businesses. And really, they're doing great. You can see more visible Somalis when you come to the Twin City area. It's just their business just growing.
This may be far away from sub-Saharan African cities such as Mogadishu, yet there is no mistaking the inspiration for much of this part of Minneapolis. Somalis adapted quickly to life in America, and pretty soon they were building that most American of icons, the shopping mall. But this isn't any average American shopping mall. In fact, it feels like I've stepped off an American street and straight back home into Somalia. Everything in these shops is uncompromisingly Somali. The smell of ginger, cloves and spices of Somali tea, the vibrant colors and the constant din of conversation form the background to this unique environment. For the men, this is a place to gather to discuss latest events of the homeland in their mother tongue. For the women, there are no Western designer labels and accessories. Fashion here is strictly traditional, even down to the tattoos. The Abu Bakr al-Siddiqui Islamic Center is another important gathering point for the community. It's the largest mosque in Minneapolis with the biggest congregation. And it serves not only for prayer and religious teaching, but as a direct link to information and contact with the homeland. It also plays an important role in helping settle new immigrants. From his pulpit, or minbar, the imam here presides over a large network within the Somali community across the U.S., with influence that stretches right back to their homeland.
Community started growing up. Then they started to sponsor their families in East Africa when they were brought from East Africa. There are opportunities in this state better than other states. Yeah, that's a fact. Then the Somalis are interconnected. Their extended families, their cousins attracted each other. Even from the other states, they attracted from people who've been over there, and they can get jobs because translation jobs they can find as a community.
This is also the mosque that was regularly attended by most of the 20 young men who returned to Somalia to fight foreign invaders with Al-Shabaab, the organization which has openly allied itself with Al-Qaeda financially as well as ideologically.
We, as a Somali American or immigrant community, when we come here, we don't usually have a lot of resources available for our youth, especially in this neighborhood where the resource for youth in general is almost non-existent. So the only institution that we have is the one we brought with us, is the mosque institution. And that's where youth programs started.
Burhan Hassan, a model student who had aspirations of becoming a doctor, spent a lot of free time here. Abdirasaq Bihi, Burhan's uncle, says there is no doubting the mosque's influence on these boys.
If you have your kid after school go into the mosque, that's the best bright and any parent can achieve. So any mom, single mom especially, who has a kid ending up in the back of the seat of the police car is a shame. So the best parent is the one who has their kids in the mosque.
But this tight-knit, self-contained community was not immune to external forces. The Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in 2006 stirred up nationalist feelings. Outrage that a foreign power would try to take control of the government through military force was a unifying sentiment. Young, educated Somalis started to focus their attention on the invasion of their homeland. Fury at the interference from a foreign power escalating, looking to help Somalia in its struggle. Many with the passion and a readiness to embrace militancy. By the end of 2006, Somalia had been ravaged internally by a conflict that pitted a group calling itself the Union of Islamic Courts against the warlords that had controlled and pillaged the country for years. The Union of Islamic Courts, a grassroots movement started by a group of young preachers, businessmen and teachers, had ignited a wave of revulsion towards the warlords. The Islamic courts were looking to establish a more religious discipline and order to the chaos that had kept Somalia in poverty and violence for so long. With widespread support, in 2006, they ran the warlords out of most of southern Somalia and formed a government. But the success and popularity of the Union of Islamic Courts alarmed Western powers and their African allies. Some of their rhetoric preached the spreading of Islam. Ethiopia, a predominantly Christian state, became alarmed.
There was concern that Somalia might already have become something of a refuge for extremist elements, and there was some proof of that, not a lot, but some. We know, with the benefit of hindsight, that Al-Ittihad al-Islami, which is a now defunct organization, was operating in Somalia going back to the mid-90s. We know that Al-Qaeda had some operatives, some cells that were functioning in Somalia. They go back to the early 1990s, and this is based on captured Al-Qaeda documents. So there were little bits of smoke that were showing up in Somalia, suggesting a problem.
With political support from the Bush administration in Washington, Ethiopian forces invaded, with the aim of toppling Somalia's new Islamic leadership. Reverberations would be felt on US soil. With each casualty of the conflict, anti-American sentiments grew stronger, playing right into the hands of those who believed in the concept of global jihad.
The Ethiopian invasion in Somalia, in 2007 was really at an insult to injury. Somalia was already bleeding for so long, for 17, 18, 19 years, if we start from 1988. And then when Ethiopia, decided to interfere and crash the only hope that Somalis have seen for in 17 years, which was supported both implicitly and explicitly by the US government. I think Somalis felt that there was a justified, if you want, obligation to contribute financially, to contribute with your life if you have to.
For at least 20 young American Somali men from Minneapolis, that was a price they were willing to pay.
What happened was a systematic, highly sophisticated indoctrination or radicalization that extremely very difficult to understand.
And this radicalization extended to such model students as 17-year-old Burhan Hassan.
My sister gets a call from the school, a voicemail, and a teacher says that, oh, Burhan, what happened to him? It's unusual, he never missed school. Is he sick? Then my sister gets suspicious and calls me. And it's about evening, we are all glued on the TV to see what's happening with the election. She's a mom. She gets up early in the morning. Burhan is not there. So in the morning, we families get together. We call, as usual, we start with the calls to the hospitals, to the police stations, to friends. Then one of the families they get a itinerary. That was not right, on the desk of an uncle. And we all got suspicious that they were leaving. So we went to the travel agency, and they told us older men who said they were uncles were with them buying the tickets with cash. Then we immediately the police comes and they summon us to the FBI. Then we get interviewed, then that's how it started.
What started as a case of a missing minor turned into an international manhunt, leaving the community stunned.
I think there was a great deal of sadness. I mean, I don't believe that many of the community members or family members certainly knew what their sons were up to, either when they were being sort of funneled in the United States or when they got to Somalia. And I'm not sure the reaction would be much different than you'd see in a reaction in another family. So the understanding and sympathy for people who feel a really heart-rending connection to a home country that's riven by violence and riven by civil war is understandable, but that's a federal violation, and we've got to pursue it.
The families, the Somali community, as well as the law enforcement agencies wanted answers. How did these young men get involved with such a radical fringe element? How were they recruited? And what made them want to risk their lives in a conflict thousands of miles away? The focus of law enforcement authorities was immediately placed on the symbolic center of the Somali community, the Abu Bakr as-Siddiqui Mosque. All the young men who left to fight in Somalia were regulars here.
Before this issue happened, we've never thought or doubted our mosque centers. We never had any problem of this nature. So now the whole community is scared and somewhat kind of agitated, because that's the very institution where you're supposed to, that's the sanctuary.
Is what you're saying is that Burhan and presumably the other young Somalis caught up in this radicalization was radicalized at that mosque?
Religious leaders of that manage that we put them in a position where they manage the mosque. Those are responsible for radicalization of our kids.
The Abu Bakr as-Siddiqui Mosque was put under observation, as were its religious leaders, by a local police force with no experience of conducting such complex investigations. For the law enforcement authorities here in Minneapolis, dealing with the Somali community went from issues such as gang violence, petty crimes, and social exclusion to the shock of now having to deal with homegrown jihadists with an international agenda.
We've heard from members of the community concerns that a mosque or mosques were involved in recruitment in the radicalization process. We don't investigate mosques or churches or other places of worship. We investigate individuals.
Then Khalid said there are many people who saying in their tongue that they are Muslims, but their heart they are not.
The leaders of the mosque insist they had nothing to do with the radicalization of the young men, and instead suggest that these young men had been influenced from afar.
I don't know how, I don't understand how. Just they disappeared. They were talking to each other. They were listening. They were going to the internet. They were seeing what's going on. Some other people, Somalis who left from Europe or from Australia, were calling them to come to Somalia to defend their countries. These are their influential, these different things. Most of them, I think, and they were friends and they know each other. And as the other people influence each other, as they are close to each other.
In fact, modern technology is widely seen as a primary source for recruitment. One that had become popular with many paramilitary groups, including Al-Shabaab.
Even going back, for example, to the 1980s, if you wanted to get a message, for example, from jihadist camps fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, you might have to touch someone. You know, by that I mean go to a training camp or read about something in a newspaper. You had to have some physical contact with the movement. Today, in the age of Skype and the internet, people can touch with a clan or a family member instantly. And so even minor political alterations thousands of miles away can, within 24 hours, have a ripple effect in a place like Minneapolis.
But Burhan's family was not prepared to give up on him. They devised a way to bring him home.
We had a plan that nobody knew, that to get him out of Somalia into the U.S. Embassy in the neighboring country, Kenya.
But the plan came to an abrupt end with a phone call from Al-Shabaab leaders to Burhan's family, saying he had been martyred or killed in battle. His uncle says there is evidence to suggest that Burhan's death was not so straightforward.
So what you're saying is that you suspect that Al-Shabaab executed Burhan because Burhan was having doubts and was thinking about leaving Al-Shabaab?
I'm not suspecting it. We have confirmed it with different, including another youth and different sources, even some with Al-Shabaab, confirmed to us that he was killed. He became a liability to them. The American youth become a liability.
The whole of the Somali community is still trying to understand. Almost every aspect of their lives here in the US has been impacted by the decision of these young men to fight and kill, and in some cases die, for the homeland. Al-Shabaab had become the rebel group now challenging the Union of Islamic Courts, who were integrated into the US-supported interim government. While it is widely acknowledged that they brought order to some lawless areas of southern Somalia, their methods were often questioned by many in the country who claimed that they ruled by fear, not by respect. Their struggle no longer nationalist, but one of religion and ideology.
The vast majority of Somalis today, in my view, are still moderate Muslims, followers of Sufi beliefs, believe in the Shafi sect. They're not sympathetic particularly towards Al-Shabaab or the extremist elements that have come in, particularly the foreign elements. They're intimidated by them, but they're not sympathetic towards them. But it was this minority element that was well organized and well financed and able to exert enormous influence on the situation, which they have done.
Their methods were at times ruthless and very public. Destroying the tombs of followers of Sufism. imposing the belief that their deaths should not be marked. Public floggings and the burning of illicit crops would be routine disciplinary retribution. The more severe violators would have limbs cut off or be executed. Al-Shabaab wanting to impose their beliefs as the standards of proper Islamic behavior. Their cause became popular among many Muslims from around the world who wanted to join the jihad. The best known of the so-called foreign fighters is perhaps Omar Hamami. Born in Alabama, his mother a Southern Baptist, his father a Muslim immigrant from Syria. He became known as Abu Mansur al-Amriki, or the American. Al-Shabaab uses him in their internet-based recruitment videos, a poster boy to advertise their cause. He called on all Somalis to return home and fight for their country and for a new world order.
So this is the promise of Abu Mansur, the official spokesman of Harak Shabab Mujahideen, that we're going to besiege Baydawa from all angles. So this is one of the sides of Baydawa that we're actively cutting off.
Night by night, day by day, Mujahideen spreading all over the place. Month by month, year by year, keeping them Kafirs living in fear.
But Al-Shabaab's boasting of being associated and partially funded by Al-Qaeda meant that they were now on the US radar. For Washington, they were a terror organization.
Bomb by bomb, blast by blast, only gonna bring back the glorious past. Mortar by mortar, shell by shell, only gonna stop when I send them to hell.
I think terrorism, if you look at the classic definition, is people who want to accomplish a political end through violence. And clearly we saw some of that happening in these cases. We saw individuals with direct connectivity to Al-Qaeda, members of the Al-Qaeda, what we call Al-Qaeda of East Africa, connected to both Shabaab and to training for Westerners, Europeans, etc., Africans going to camps in Somalia. So I don't think it's an unfair characterization. I know it's rough for a 17 or 18 or 19-year-old to be characterized that way, but they're talking about training with people who want to murder innocents. It's a tough message.
The repercussions of being labeled terrorists would be felt well beyond the immediate families and friends of the young Somali-American men who joined Al-Shabaab. The whole community felt they have also now been painted with the same brush.
To look like a peacock. So you can take home your art projects this week and show Mom and Dad all the animals that you're going to meet.
Preparing for a trip to the Minneapolis Zoo.
Is that funny?
It's a peacock.
What color are birds' beaks?
These kindergarten students are the newest generation of Somali Americans. They were born, raised, and now starting their education in the US.
Help, Abdul Nasser? The same thing as before.
Here at the Best Academy East Charter School, their courses are made to measure for East African pupils.
You sound out this for me?
They study the Quran and Arabic, as well as the normal Minnesota state curriculum. And since most of the children are of Somali background, there is no problem fitting in.
I feel much comfortable in this school because my other school, there wasn't a lot of Somalians. It was just full of Arabic, and I didn't understand what they were saying. And they weren't really good people to me.
Actually, they learned more because I feel comfortable around them.
I wasn't that bold.
For the school directors, having the culture reflected in the school was the crucial component.
There's a cultural lens that we all look through, and the students bring their culture to the school. And if we can match the culture of the school to home in some aspects, it makes the students feel very comfortable. And then once they're comfortable, then we can start teaching them the reading, writing, and arithmetic.
They will also be taught the traditions, history and struggles of their mother country, both at home and at school, and with that, strengthening their bond with Somalia, making sure they too are looking homeward like generations before. Even though many Somalis barely have any memories of growing up back in Somalia, and they have lived a largely American life, they remain acutely aware of their homeland, the war, and those loved ones they left behind. It may well be the young men and women of the community who have been made to pay the highest price for this attachment to their motherland. They were the ones most targeted by law enforcement authorities. Their ties to their homeland had become a liability. Several of these university students were friends with some of the 20 who returned to Somalia. They have no doubt that their decision has impacted on their own lives as well, as Somalis and as Americans. But they understand why their friends felt compelled to go back.
I don't think it was an easy decision. They watched the TV, get internet news information, what was taking place in Somalia, especially when Ethiopian troops was getting in Somalia. All this stuff was going on. Mothers was raped and girls was killed and everything was messy. So they get in this information, they feel like, oh, here we're powerless. We don't have anything to do. But if we get there, at least we can contribute something in the community at that time.
For us to understand the complication of these young men leaving, we have to understand what was happening in Somalia, what was happening with the relationship between Somalia and Ethiopia. We have to understand the U.S. foreign policy and how they were involved and how they play a role, I would say a negative role in this case, initially, in promoting the Ethiopians to come and invade another country. And even though these young men didn't grow up in Somalia, just like the rest of us, there's still that sense of connection, that sense of nationhood.
I think that initially, when you first look into this problem, the nationalism draws you in. My country, this is my people, this is my nation that's being hurt, and then once you start digging deeper, and I'm guessing that most of the boys, when they first were introduced to this, just like all of us, they heard the headlines, all these Somali women being killed, all these little girls being raped, and that brings emotion into everybody. And it's not Islamic at that time, it's nationalism.
The guys who left, we actually, some of us we went to school with them, we knew them from high school, university, neighborhood. I think most of them just were looking for an opportunity to bring about a change to this 2 decades of killing and all these civil war internally, and then now an invasion. And so one of the things that had surprised me is that as radical as Shabab may be, it gave these boys an opportunity for them to participate in something.
Some of the youth that live in this state or other states in the United States, they lead a life of, in a gang. They are either in a gang activity or they're not doing something that's beneficial for them. So basically, when they see people who are calling for them and they find out it's a sense of belonging, then they go for it.
It's a post 9/11 reaction that happens, that anytime there is anything that has Islamic elements, the government tend to react in this very shoot now, ask question later type of thing.
When this young man left it in United States to Somalia, many of us didn't know anything. We really, really was innocent. We even didn't know what was going on. Later, we just wake up, this whole rumor, and this really the authority was getting in the young people, targeting them, being questioning. Some of them was meeting with at home. Some of them had exams. So it was really, really feel like very frustrating and was aggressive.
I felt betrayed because this is my country, and this is my country, and this is the country that I live in is doing something wrong to my home country, and then you start questioning yourself, and I think that's when they also, I believe, the feeling that the boys must have shared, I kind of understand. You feel betrayed, like, what am I going to do now? Who do I side with? And that's when you have to decide, how do I feel about the American foreign policies concerning Somalia?
And, for that matter, American domestic policies concerning Somalis. Some were put on flying ban lists, many forced to endure long waits and searches at airports. FBI interrogations had become routine. Ironically, the community responded by turning unto itself, withdrawing its collaboration as the government stepped up efforts to get more information.
The community were so horrified, but also so scared of the repercussions that everybody decides, to step back and retreat almost. There were some conversations with government officials, with FBI, with officials from the Homeland Security. I would argue that the community has become very fearful, very enclosed in certain ways. I think most people not wanting to be, their name to be associated with this event.
This is the first ever meeting of the Minneapolis Young Achievers, young Somali-American men and women here to offer each other support, members of a community that often feels isolated from their environment. When offered to come up and convey experiences, thoughts and artistic expression seem to always travel back to a faraway homeland, blended with American street poetry.
Boom! There goes a massive explosion, the same one that ripped my country apart with such commotion. 19 years later, here I stand, reciting a poem about my motherland. Boom, boom, night and day, boom, boom, day and night, boom, boom, every day. Bazookas by the hour, gunshots by the minute, life's gone in a second.
Somalia. I said Somalia is dead. Don't play. You heard exactly what I said. Always talking about how we can bring Somalia back to life, but there's always that one guy who believes everybody there should just die. And we should rebuild the country on those who survive. Now, the majority may agree, but how can I agree to such lies? When I've seen their pain with my own two eyes, too many times have I seen a mother with 5 kids walk down the pothole-infested streets of Riverside. As she walks to a park, I look to my left, then look to my right. It's funny how there's never a father in sight. He's probably doing his job somewhere at a coffee shop, chewing chai, talking about where Somalia went wrong, like he ain't part of the problem. Alone. I must have let the cat out the bag. Or maybe pulled the rabbit out the hat, and as a matter of fact, where do you think they picked up the bad habits at?
Allah's word taken out of context, killing civilians like it's a contest. It's time for the truth to be revealed and have this fakeness unconcealed. No more oppression, no more tears, no more depression, no more fear, no more torture. Let's just get back to our old beautiful culture.
But what is the old, beautiful culture? Like any immigrant community, the culture is ever evolving, a hybrid of sorts of the old traditions mixed with new ways of thinking. This is my 3rd visit to Minneapolis in recent years, and I have noticed a growing rejection of American ways, of American values, of American culture. Young Somali men and women are, more than ever, looking towards religion and towards a homeland they barely know in search of an identity. While the USA may have felt immune from so-called homegrown terror threats, what happened in the Somali population here in Minneapolis will serve as a reminder that there is growing agitation in many communities across the country. With ongoing instability throughout the Horn of Africa and Al-Shabaab gaining strength and influence as the fighting rages on in Somalia, the US may have to re-evaluate its internal security as well as its foreign policies if it wants to avoid new generations of homegrown jihadists.